For every multi-platinum selling album in the 90s, there's another 10 or 20 behind that were just as good, just didn't catch on as much and get the mainstream attention and sales. We're going to highlight 10 underrated 90s albums that still to this day do not get the credit they deserve on this episode, Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're local, you can absolutely shop with us in one of our Metroplex locations. If you're not local but you're in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com for new and pre-order vinyl. Would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube and follow us across social media at NTX Vinyl is the handle, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Let's talk about some 90s records that are underrated and they do not get the appreciation they deserve. I always love these videos because it gives me a chance to pull some albums out that I maybe haven't listened to all that often, or maybe you're not familiar with, and it's a little out of the ordinary versus talking about more kind of mainstream popular artists. So I'm going to dive into some of these. This is hard. The 90s is, such a ripe period, especially for me being, in my primitive high school years during that time. So many albums were huge sellers. If you go from the top of the charts, bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and those types of bands that really dominated the scene from a sales perspective, from a touring perspective. But like I mentioned at the start, for every one of those huge bands, there was tons and tons of other bands that wrote and released great albums that just don't get the attention they deserve. So those are the ones we're going to talk about today. These are in no particular order. I just tried to pull out some of my favorites that maybe don't get as much attention. So let's start with the first one. This is one that definitely doesn't get the attention it deserves. This is Kerosene Hat by Cracker. Not a band that comes up all that often when you hear about, the best records of the 90s or the most popular artists of the 90s, but it's a great album, and I will tell you, it is aged very well. You go back and listen to this now, and you're like, man, they actually had a pretty unique vibe. Most known for the big single, Low. The title track was, I think, maybe a single as well, a song called Loser. One of those bands that they didn't quite fit into like the grunge thing. They're from Virginia. I had to look it up. So they weren't weren't from LA, weren't from Seattle, weren't from any big scene necessarily. But they've got great songs. This is their second album, and I think this is when they really hit the sweet spot as from a songwriting standpoint. Because you listen to these tracks and compare them to their debut record, which I know a little bit, but I think this one, really stands out. And it makes sense why they were getting attention, because the songwriting is really dialed in. And like I said, I think it's got a bit of a unique vibe to it that didn't really fit into any, scene or format. Because again, back in the 90s, this came out in 93. It's all about radio for all of these. It had, it was radio and MTV. That's how you broke a record back then if you were in the music industry. And so, they got some exposure. They were able to tour extensively on the back of this through the mid 90s. And they've released a bunch of other records and are, I believe, still an active band to this day on some level. So I'm glad that this record has really stood up well, and it's a fun listen to go back on. Next on the list, 1995, going to pull out one I talk about often, and it should be as no surprise, Soup by Blind Melon. Their second record and their final record with original lead vocalist Shannon Hoon. It's one of my favorite records from the 90s, believe it or not. Very underrated and underappreciated, not only as a record, but as a band. And I think so much of that is just because, again, it was very short-lived, 2 albums. You know, the debut record came out in 92, blew up with the single No Rain, of course. And then this dropped in 95. But by the time this dropped, Shannon was kind of spiraling out of control, in and out of rehab, and then couldn't hang in there. But it's front to back. I would stack this against any other record from the 90s. I really would. I would put this up against any of the big sellers of the 90s. Kicks off with Galaxy, which is an incredible lead-off track. Other highlights for me would be Toads Across the Floor is fantastic. Walk is a great acoustic bass track. Vernie is fantastic. 2x4. Another acoustic one, Mouthful of Cavities. Lemonade. Really, really good. If you're not familiar with Soup, but you know the name Blind Melon, maybe you know the big single from the first record, like, I'd really encourage you to check it out. It's worth a listen, front to back. I think the songwriting, and again, kind of following on what I was saying about Cracker, they didn't really fit in a mold either. No one knew if Blind Melon was like a grunge band, a jam band. Like, it's a really kind of odd thing. And on that first record, like most bands' first record, they were just trying to figure out who they were. So by the time they settle into their second record, now they're big rock stars. They got a bunch of money. They can do whatever they want. And it's interesting to see what they settled into, and very sad to see, like, man, this is where they were headed, because it would have been so incredible to hear some more songs from Shannon and the band. So, you know, they went on and reformed years later, the original members, and have done some other stuff with a different lead singer, and kept the music alive, which I give them all props for. But it's hard not to go back and look at this one and just think, what if? You know, that's the big thing with Blind Melon and Soup. What if there would have been another one to follow this up, other than Nico, which was obviously kind of a B-sides compilation. But to hear any more new music from Shannon would have been a blessing, but unfortunately it wasn't in the cards. Next on the list, very similar, unfortunately, from a topical conversation, not from a musical conversation, but you want to talk about Gone Too Soon. The greatness of Jeff Buckley. One album. This is all he got. Came out in 94. If you don't know this album, produced by the great Andy Wallace, one of the greatest voices in rock, and especially greatest voices that ever only released one album. Lots of other material that has come out, but only one studio album. Front to back, Mojo Pen, title track, Last Goodbye, So Real. Maybe most known for his cover of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. Eternal Life is a great track. It's again, kind of similar to Soup. This is a perfect album to me. It doesn't fall flat in any way. Really incredible songwriting. Of course, the voice, but even the guitar playing. Go watch some of Jeff Buckley's live stuff. There's a DVD they put out, which I'm sure you can look it up on YouTube, where he played live at the Metro in Chicago. And check out his guitar work on that. It's fantastic. I think it's a three-piece band, and man, they're good. And they really bring these songs to life live. But the recorded versions are fantastic as well. And there's a funny tie-in too. When Blind Melon was recording Soup in New Orleans with Andy Wallace, Jeff Buckley came through on tour, and the band and Andy went and saw him play. Read that in a couple of Blind Melon books, where they talked about getting to meet Jeff Buckley and see him at a little club in New Orleans. Would have been pretty damn cool. But definitely one of those, another one of those, you know, what ifs, if he could have gone on and written more music. So definitely check out Grace if you're not familiar. Highly underappreciated. Next on the list, another sophomore album. This is Betty by Helmet. It's a little 10-inch version, which is cool. This is a hard album to get because they've rarely reissued it. There's only a couple versions of it. Originally came out in 94. This is an original pressing on 10-inch vinyl. You know, Helmet came out with their first record with the huge song Unsung, and it was a big hit across rock alternative radio. By the time this one dropped, I mean, I remember Wilma's Rainbow, I think, was the lead-off single. Milk Toast, Biscuits for Smut. I can't remember what were the singles off of this one, because honestly, the band just kind of dropped off the radar, at least for me. They didn't get, again, the appreciation I think they deserved, and I think this album is far superior than the first record, but you just don't hear about it all that much. I love the cover. It's just a it's funny. It's such a juxtaposition to how heavy and how brutal their music is, which is great. But one of those bands that I think also, this one's mixed by Andy Wallace, so a lot of tie-ins here. This, again, 1994, so right in that same period, Andy Wallace was really busy with a lot of really, really great bands. But another one that's still active and still a band to this day, but I think going back to the first record, and my favorite, Betty, is when they were really at the top of their game. So another one that's a little underrated and underappreciated. Check out Betty if you're not familiar. Next on the list, certainly an artist you're familiar with, but maybe not an album that you're familiar with. The Greatness of Jerry Cantrell. This is Boggy Depot. This came out in '97. You know Jerry from Alice in Chains, obviously. And from a timing perspective, the reason why this exists is because of Lane Staley and his addiction and the downtime that the band had. Alice in Chains released their self-titled record in '96, I want to say, and but they couldn't even really tour behind it because Lane was in such bad shape. So Jerry goes off and recruits. You know, he's got Sean Kinney from Alice in Chains on drums, so it's not too far off. But you got Mike Inez on bass, so it's kind of like this is, and you got Les Claypool playing some songs on bass. So a really great kind of mix of some outside influence as well as what Jerry knew with Alice in Chains. And the thing about Jerry and Alice in Chains in general, you see so much appreciation and love for Lane Staley, which I get because one of a kind, unique voice. But Jerry was the force of this band, and he still is to this day, you know, with William Duvall. But, you know, Jerry wrote the vast majority of the songs, the vast majority of the music, a big portion of the lyrics. I'm talking about Alice in Chains stuff. And so when you lead into an album like Boggy Depot, or he released Degradation Trip, his second solo album a number of years after this one, but they're really, really solid. The only big single from this one was a song called Cut You In, which honestly I don't think is one of the strongest on this. I love the lead-off track, Dick Eye, Settling Down, Breaks My Back, Devil by His Side. Fantastic. Unfortunately, another one that's very hard to get on vinyl. They have not reissued this as much as they need to. They've reissued Degradation Trip a couple times, but for some reason, Boggy Depot has kind of stayed in the background. I'm hoping that they come to the table and bring this one to a broader audience because it's such a fantastic album. Really, I mean, if you like Alice in Chains, you're gonna love this record. Some of Jerry's best work are on this album and the solo album. You know, I love Alice in Chains stuff as well, but don't deny his solo works because they really stand up well, even though they are definitely underappreciated. Next on the list, Live Through This by Hole. Timing wise, a very, very difficult album. Came out in '94, literally right around the time of Kurt's death. I don't know how she went out and toured behind this at that point, but I guess she figured you got to stay busy. There's always discussion around this record and whether or not she wrote the songs, whether or not Kurt was writing, and whether or not Billy Corgan was involved. I don't know. All I know is that this wasn't Hole's first record, you know, this was their second record, and they went on to make some pretty good records after this. And so, but I think this is still their peak. I love the shot of Courtney on the back as a little girl. You know, Violets, great song. The big singles were Doll Parts and Miss World, I think. Credit in the Straight World's a cool track. Really, really good. I'm looking to see Mastered by Bob Ludwig. I'm trying to see who kind of produced and engineered by Bob Holdery and Sean Slade. Okay, not any big names on the production side, but just a great rock record. I think it gets a bad rap just because of the timing of it and because of her relationship with Kurt and so much discussion around that. It's got to be a hard world for Courtney to live in, honestly. Being tied to something so tragic and confusing, and from when they were just kids, essentially, you know, early to mid 20s. But the music stands up. That's what I love about it. You still got the music to go back to, and I think this is a great kind of punk influenced grunge record, if you could say, because I think it's pretty raw and definitely underappreciated as it pertains to like 90s records. Next on the list, a fantastic album by one of the greatest voices in rock and roll, especially from the 90s era. This is Euphoria Morning from Chris Cornell, of course. This was his first solo release after Soundgarden's initial breakup, after Down the Upside. This came out in 99 and definitely underappreciated. The only real single from this was the lead-off track called Can't Change Me, which honestly is probably my least favorite track on the whole album. It's a good song. But if you get into When I'm Down is maybe my favorite. Sweet Euphoria is a beautiful acoustic track. Flutter Girl was actually a outtake from Super Unknown, I believe. Preaching the End of the World is fantastic. And then some heavier songs like Pillow of Your Bones. Wave Goodbye was a tribute to Jeff Buckley. Speaking of the great Jeff Buckley. So this is a hard one. Funnily enough, it was originally entitled Euphoria Morning, as it states, and the label convinced them to change it from morning with a U to actually morning, like the time of day. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea, but on the vinyl release, when it was finally reissued on vinyl, many years later, I think 2015 is the first vinyl release, and Chris changed it back to the original title. It's one that I really cherish. I really love this record. I saw Chris on this tour in, I think, early 2000s at a smaller venue here in Dallas, and it was fantastic. He was in top form, and this is the only release between that breakup of Soundgarden, that initial breakup, and when he formed Audioslave, and he didn't do any more solo work until years later. So if you're a Cornell fan, Soundgarden fan, Audioslave fan, check out Euphoria Morning. Fantastic, underappreciated 90s record. All right, next on the list, we could have chosen a couple records from this band. I would say next to Blind Melon, probably the most underappreciated and underrated band of the 90s, and that is the Screaming Trees. I would almost maybe even put them above Blind Melon, only because Blind Melon only had 2 records and was more or less very short-lived. Screaming Trees was around from, like, I think their first record came out 86, 87. This is Sweet Oblivion from 92, which I guess you would say there is their breakthrough. Nearly I Lost You was the big track on the single soundtrack. That's where a lot of people, including myself, really got exposed to them. But this album, front to back, Shadow of the Season, Dollar Bill, The Secret Kind, fantastic. The late great Mark Lanigan on vocals, and you got Gary Lee Conner and Van Conner, which I believe Van Conner just recently passed away too, and then the great Barrett Martin on drums, who also played drums on Mad Seasons above. Really, really great album. Heavy guitars. If you like Mark Lanigan's voice, you're gonna love this record. I could have chosen Dust. I could have chosen Uncle Anesthesia. Again, I think their whole catalog is so underrated and underappreciated, especially for what they meant to the Pacific Northwest kind of grunge Seattle scene. They were one of the grandfathers of it, along with Soundgarden and, a lot of those other kind of early punk bands, Green River, Malfunction, Mother Love Bone. Like, Screaming Trees was around for all of that stuff, and they never ever broke through and got the big credit they deserved. I did see them one time. I wish I would have gone seen like a club show, but I saw them at Lollapalooza. I think it must have been Lollapalooza 96, because that was the one with Metallica and Soundgarden on the Down and the Upside tour, and Screaming Trees had a daytime slot. I remember walking through the back of the venue while Nearly Lost You was playing and thinking, man, that voice, just a voice that it can never be replicated. I love his work with Screaming Trees. I love his solo stuff, and I love Mark's stuff when he gets involved with Queens of the Stone Age too. So a lot of great music came from Mark Lanigan, and I'm happy to have it. And this is one for sure that I think stands up at the top of his discography. All right, here's one pretty unique in the band's catalog. Big catalog. If you're going to talk Red Hot Chili Peppers, this is a very unique record, and that is because, kind of like Pearl Jam has their drumming sagas with different drummers, different eras, Chili Peppers is even, I would say, even more in that vein with guitar players, because you have John Frusciante coming in and out of the band. You've got the original guitar player, I'm blanking on the name, Hillel Slovak, I believe. And then you also have Josh Klinghoffer who came in now. But this is the sole release with the greatness of Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction. Just a fantastic record. I think it does not get the credit it deserves. You've got kicks off with Warped, which is a fantastic opening track. The big singles were Aeroplane, and I think Warped was a single as well. I love the title track. I love Walkabout. I love their subtle stuff with my friends. Just such a great album. And again, I think it's a little edgier because of Dave Navarro. There's a little less finesse, a little less lead work. Not that there's not some killer solos, but when I compare this to like, Frusciante, Chili Peppers, it's got just, like I said, just a little different edge to it. And it's just unique because it's that one album in their entire discography, which is a large discography with Dave Navarro on it. So I always appreciate that, being a big Jane's fan and being a big Dave Navarro fan. So I gravitate towards this one a lot. Like I love the period of Chili Peppers between, Blood Sugar Sex Magic, this one and into Californication, like that period, and this one's sitting right in the middle of that is really cool. I like Mother's Milk as well, but I don't have the whole discography of it. I do love One Hot Minute and think it definitely doesn't get the appreciation it deserves on one of those underrated 90s records from 1995. Last but not least, this is one that gets overshadowed a bit, mainly because of the album that came after it. So Radiohead's The Bends. I'm pretty sure I've had this on other lists because I absolutely love it. This is Radiohead when they were a rock band, more essentially. Essentially like when you get into OK Computer, yes, there's still a rock band, still lots of guitars going in there, but you can hear where they're going with No Computer, with OK Computer as they, venture into Kid A and Amnesiac and those types of things. But if you go back to the beginning of Pablo Honey, very young, very green, some great potential. And this then drops as The Bends, and man, just killer, absolutely killer from front to back. Planet Telex, High and Dry and Fake Plastic Trees are kind of like the kind of more mellow tracks on this one, but the song the song My Iron Lung, Black Star, and then it ends with Street Spirit. So you've got like a good mix on here of like really laid back vibe, like really vibey songs, some of the more chill ones like High and Dry, but then you've got some heavy screeching guitars. Go back and watch some live shots from this era of Radiohead and The Bends. There was one on 120 Minutes. I saw a live performance of the song Just, and man, it'll blow you away. You want to talk about some fantastic guitar work from Johnny Greenwood, and just some a different Tom York than you're used to seeing, because by the time they get into OK Computer and kind of start figuring out who they are, they became a different band essentially. And so going back to this early Radiohead stuff is always a really good reminder of where they started. And I think this was definitely the peak of Radiohead. Them as just a straight ahead rock band, more or less, was just what this album represents. So fantastic record, and a little underappreciated just because of OK Computer coming right after it. So there you go. That's 10 albums that I think are underappreciated from the 90s. There's a huge list of albums beyond this. This was just me picking out 10 that I happen to have in my collection. Love talking about these records. It's an era of music that, as you know, means the world to me. So glad that I have the opportunity to share some opinions on some of these records with you. My name is G.I. Sanders, and we'll see you again next time on another episode of Talking About Records.